Hi, I'm Mehul Harry with Developer Express. In this screencast, we're going to take a look at how to hook up the ASPxGridView with the link server mode data source. And we're also going to take a look at how to use a store procedure with the link server mode data source. So let's get right into it. My goal in this video is to show in 3 different levels how to set up LINQ with the ASPxGridView. So in the first section, we're going to show step by step how to create a link to SQL class, add the link to SQL entities, and then set up the link server mode data source and bind it to the ASPxGridView. Then I'll show you how to use the store procedure with LINQ and bind it to the ASPxGridView. And the last section is a little more advanced topic that shows you how to use one of the events of the link server mode data source to customize it. I've started with a blank ASP.NET Web project. I've added nothing to it so far. The first thing we'll want to add is a link to SQL class. Now we can do this by right-clicking and selecting Add New Item. You can also use the menu if you prefer. Now I'll select Link to SQL class and I'll just give it a name. In this case, I'm going to use the Northwind database, so I'll set this to Northwind. Now you get a message saying that you should probably add this class to the app code folder, and I'll allow it to create that app code folder and add it. Once the file is created, the designer will come up. You'll see 2 things here. You'll see the object relational designer as well as the methods pane. Now this is where the store procedures and functions from your database are displayed. So we'll want to open up the Server Explorer so we can drag entities onto the designer. Now in my case, I'm going to point to the Northwind database that I have in my local SQL Server 2008 instance. Now, if I select all the tables and drag them onto the designer, it's going to go ahead and create those entities for us, as well as keep the relationships, any foreign keys, and so forth. Now we see that we have all the tables as well as the links to it. Now if I hold down the control and use the scroll on the mouse, we can zoom in and zoom out. Now let's bind this to an ASPxGridView. We'll go to the design mode of the default ASPX page. Now I'll start by dropping an ASPxGridView onto the form. Next, from the Smart tag, I'm going to choose a new data source. This will bring up the data source configuration wizard and allow you to choose any one of the different data sources. Now in this designer, we have several data sources. You can use the standard LINQ data source provided by Microsoft, or you can also use the link server mode data source. Now I recommend the link server mode data source because it does have some advantages over the standard LINQ data source, and you can see them in our online demo. So if you go to the online demo of the ASPxGridView under data binding and choose using LINQ data source, it'll bring up this demo which shows off some of the differences between the link server mode data source as well as the standard LINQ data source. The server mode feature allows you to work with a large number of records in your backend. So let's say in your SQL server you have 100,000 rows or more. This ASPxGridView is only going to fetch the rows it needs to display. By pushing the work onto the SQL server, this allows your front end to work a lot faster and more efficient. So I'll select the link server mode data source, click OK. This is going to create a new link server mode data source and it's bound to it, but because we don't have the link server mode data source pointing to any context yet, it's actually not going to create any of the columns yet. So let's go ahead and bind the link server mode data source to one of the link entities we just created from the Northwind database. So we want to set the context name type property. Now if we don't see anything right away, that's because we'll have to save and compile the project first. So let me do that. Now that I have it compiled, we can set the context name type property to the Northwind data context, and I'll set the table name to customers. Now you'll see that there are some other 3 properties available here: the enable, delete, enable insert, and enable update. Now if I enable these 3 properties, this will allow the ASPxGridView to modify the data from the link entities without you having to write any extra code to bind that up. So it's a great way to get edit, update, delete features to the ASPxGridView. Now you'll also notice that once I did bind the table name, the ASPxGridView went ahead and created the columns for us. So let's get rid of some of these columns that we'll probably won't need. So I'll get rid of fax, let's get rid of postal code, and we'll get rid of contact title, and I'll get rid of region as well. Let's also add an auto format to the ASPxGridView. For this demo, I'll just use something with some nice bright colors like youthful and apply it. Now let's take a look at this in action. And here's our ASPxGridView that shows off the customers table using the link server mode data source. Now let's take a look at how we can bind a store procedure. Use the store procedure to grab the information and bind it to the link server mode data source. Now, to add a store procedure, let's go back to the designer. And if you don't see this methods pane, make sure you right click and you're looking at it. It should say, if it's hidden, it'll say show methods pane and you'll be able to see it. And this is where we'll drag and drop store procedures from the database. So let's take a look at what store procedures are available. Now, we have different things like getting customer order history and details. Now, if we double click on sales by category, it'll bring it up so we can take a look at the SQL behind the store procedure. Let me first hide these panes so we can get a little better view. Now, we can see here that it takes two parameters, category name and order year, which has a default from 1998. And it's going to basically get information from the orders, products, and categories table by doing some various joins on them and getting back product name as well as total purchase and quantity. Let's execute the store procedure and take a look. If I right click, I have the option to execute it, and I'll pass in a category name, and I know that beverages is one of the categories, so I'll pass in beverages. And for the year, I'll just choose 1998. Now, we can see in this output window, I got 12 rows back with a product name as well as the total purchase for that product. So let's use this to bind to our store procedure. To do that, make sure you drag the store procedure that you want to use to the methods pane, and it'll be shown here. So now sales by category will be available to the Northwind data context. Let's save this. Now, to bind it to a store procedure, I actually don't need a data source here because I'll be binding it in the code. Let's also clean up our ASPX grid view. So I've gotten rid of the link server mode data source, and I'll clean up any of columns that are already existing in here. So and I also want to set auto generate columns to true because we'll be generating these from code. Now, let's go to the code behind for the default ASPX page. In the page load, the first thing we'll want to do is create a reference to the Northwind data context. I'll just call it NWD. Now, we'll create a query and point it to the Northwind data context. And we should see here sales by category. And here, when you put the parens, we see it takes two parameters. Both of them are strings. So the first one is the category name. I'll pass in produce this time. And for the year, I'll stick with 1998 because I know most of the information in that table is from 1998. Now, we'll bind this to the ASPX grid view and set its data source to the query. And finally, we'll call its data bind method. Now, before I run this, let me make sure I removed all references to the link server mode data source. And I can see here I still have the data source ID pointing to a link server mode data source, which I've already removed from this page. Now, let's save this and let's take a look at it in action. Now, the ASPX grid view gives us the results of the store procedure, which is the product and the total purchase for 1998 for the produce category. Now, let's take a look at how we can customize the link server mode data source so we can pass in some custom SQL. Now, one of the things I want to do is I'm actually going to remove the store procedure that I'm calling here, and we'll drop in the link server mode data source back on here. We'll clear out any columns that we had before, and I'll make sure that auto generate is set to false. Now, let's bind the link server mode data source. Let's bind it to the products table. Now I can see here I have a bunch of fields, so let's remove some of the fields like supplier ID and category ID. And let's just take a look at this in action. Now we've got a list of the items from the products table, but let's say I want the database to only return items where the units on order are greater than 0. So in this case, I want to get rid of all the items where units on order is equal to 0. So let's see how we can do that. The link server mode data source provides some extra events. One of them, if you take a look at the events, is selecting. Let's double click and override this event. Now in this event, we can change the query. So first one thing we'll do is we'll create a new Northwind data context. Now we'll create a new query where we'll get all the items in the products table where the units on order is greater than 0. And then we'll select all those items. And finally, we'll set the eQueryable source equal to the query we just created. The e.queryable source property is a property of the link server mode data source that allows us to override and point to any iQueryable interface. So in this case, our var query that we just created where the units on order is greater than 0 is a link to SQL query that provides a iQueryable interface. Now I'll save it and I'll compile it, and let's take a look at it in action again. Now we can see we have a lot less results because the units on order are only those items that are greater than 0. So as you saw, the link server mode data source gives you a lot of functionality. It even supports editing. Thanks for watching.